I thought staying after class would be harmless, until she said, "Extra lessons tonight," and locked the door behind me. What happened next changed everything. I had never expected a quiet Thursday evening to feel like this, like the air itself was holding its breath. The classroom was empty, the sun spilling gold through the blinds, catching dust motes that danced lazily in the warm light. And there she was, Ms. Hartley, leaning against the edge of the desk, her arms crossed, a faint curve to her lips that made my heart betray me with a small, clumsy thump. She was mid-40s, graceful in a way that seemed effortless, every movement precise yet fluid, like she owned the air around her without trying. Her dark blouse clung gently to her figure, sleeves rolled just above the elbows, revealing smooth, pale forearms. When she lifted a hand to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, I caught the faintest scent of jasmine, subtle and comforting, a trace of her presence that lingered long after she'd moved. "I thought you might need extra help tonight," she said, her voice soft, measured, almost teasing. There was a pause, a weight behind her words that made me swallow hard. Her eyes, deep, knowing, and a little weary, met mine, and I felt seen in a way I wasn't used to. My palms were clammy, and I gripped my notebook like it was a lifeline. Yeah," I said, clearing my throat. "Thanks." My voice sounded smaller than I'd intended. She stepped closer, closing the small space between us. Not aggressively, but enough that I was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her, the subtle sway of her perfume, the tiny brush of her sleeve against my arm as she reached for a textbook. I forced my attention back to the page, but my eyes kept sneaking up, catching the soft curve of her smile, the way she glanced at me with something unreadable in her expression. The room seemed quieter than it had been a moment ago, the distant hum of the air conditioner the only sound. I noticed how her foot tapped lightly against the floor, an almost imperceptible rhythm that matched the tightening in my chest. My notebook shook slightly in my hands as I tried to focus, but every word on the page blurred beneath the heat of her gaze. She leaned over to point something out in my notes, and the tip of her finger brushed mine. Just a second, long enough for me to feel the electricity, short enough that it could have been accidental. I didn't pull away. Instead, my hand stayed rooted where it was, as if waiting for her permission to linger. Not quite," she murmured, and I caught a soft lilt in her voice that made my stomach twist. Her eyes flicked up to mine, and there it was again, that look. Teasing, patient, and heavy with unspoken things. The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with anticipation, and I realized I was holding my breath. Then the unexpected happened. The door creaked open just slightly, as if someone had tried to slip in unnoticed. She stiffened for a heartbeat, and I turned my head toward the sound, just in time to see her glance back at me with a warning in her eyes. A slow, deliberate motion, as if she were reminding me, and maybe herself, what this evening really was. Her lips curved in that almost smile again, one eyebrow arched, and my heart slammed against my ribs. The tension didn't dissipate. It only deepened. Whatever had just brushed the doorframe wasn't important. What mattered was the silent promise in that glance, the pulse between us that neither of us dared to name. And then, she stepped back, her hand brushing mine once more, lingering ever so slightly, before she moved to lock the door behind me. After the click of the lock, the quiet in the classroom deepened, almost pressing in on me. My heart still thudded against my ribs, and I couldn't stop noticing her. The way her presence seemed to fill every corner of the room, soft yet insistent. She leaned casually against the edge of the desk again, but there was a tension beneath the ease, something fragile hiding behind her confidence. "I don't usually stay after hours," she said, running a finger along the edge of a notebook. Her gaze lingered on mine longer than necessary, and I felt a flicker of vulnerability that made her seem human. It was strange seeing her like this, so composed in class, so authoritative, and yet here, she wasn't putting on a mask. I cleared my throat, trying to act casual. "I appreciate you staying. I didn't want to bother you after school." "Bother me?" She raised an eyebrow, amusement threading her voice. "You could never bother me." Then her expression softened, almost imperceptibly, before she looked away. There was a pause, and I felt the weight of it. Unspoken words, hints of regrets, maybe even a tinge of loneliness. I wanted to ask her about it, to reach across whatever invisible line separated us. But I held back. Instead, I noticed the small things. The way her hand brushed hers across the notebook as she adjusted the pages. The gentle tilt of her head when she considered my work. The almost imperceptible sigh when she leaned back. Each gesture made me painfully aware of the space between us, even when she moved closer. "You know," she said quietly, almost to herself, "I didn't expect anyone to notice." Her eyes met mine again, and this time I felt the pull, something forbidden, something electric. I wanted to tell her how I noticed everything, how I noticed her. The curve of her smile when she thought no one was looking, the slight tremble in her hands when she got flustered. But I stayed silent, letting the tension build, letting my gaze follow the line of her jaw, the sway of her shoulders as she shifted. Her hand lingered near mine again, just shy of touching, and I felt the warmth like a current, small but undeniable. My pulse raced, and I forced my eyes to her face, catching a shadow of hesitation there. She wanted to reach further, I could tell. But something pulled her back. Something unspoken, unnameable, hanging between us like a fragile thread. I shouldn't be here," she said, her voice dropping slightly, almost breaking the fragile intimacy of the moment. But her eyes didn't leave mine, and I could see the conflict, the careful restraint behind the controlled calm. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I don't want you to go," I admitted, quieter than I'd intended. Her gaze softened, and for a long moment we just looked at each other. The air was heavy, charged with unspoken feelings, and every shift, every brush of her sleeve against my arm, every flicker of her eyes, spoke volumes we couldn't, or wouldn't, say out loud. And then, almost imperceptibly, her fingers touched my shoulder. A light, deliberate graze that lingered just long enough to make me shiver, and yet she pulled back immediately, as if testing a line we weren't supposed to cross. The electricity didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, heavier, impossible to ignore. She leaned back, pretending to study my notebook, but the warmth from her hand remained in my mind, a reminder of what was at stake, and what we both wanted but were too careful to name. The evening air in the classroom had grown heavier, warmer somehow, as if it were aware of us. I couldn't take my eyes off her. Ms. Hartley's fingers hovered over my notes again, brushing mine just enough to send a jolt through my arm. My chest felt tight, like my heartbeat had decided to announce itself to the entire room. "I think you're getting this," she said softly, leaning closer over the desk. Her hair brushed my shoulder, and the faint scent of jasmine followed, curling around me, making it impossible to focus on the math problems in front of me. I nodded too quickly, my hand trembling slightly as I adjusted my pen. We were close enough now that I could see the fine lines around her eyes, the warmth of her cheeks under the soft lamplight. Every detail made me more aware of the tension between us, around us, in the silence. Her presence was intoxicating, dangerous in a way I didn't fully understand yet. And then the interruption came. A sudden knock at the door made me jump, my notebook slipping slightly from my hands. She straightened immediately, the poise back in her posture, but her eyes flickered toward me with a quiet warning. My stomach twisted. Whoever it was might notice the closeness, the almost imperceptible tension between us. "Probably just someone from the janitorial staff," she murmured, though her voice held an edge I hadn't heard before. She moved toward the door, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might open it, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned back, letting out a soft breath. The moment had passed externally, but internally, it had only deepened our awareness of one another. We returned to the desk, both pretending to focus on my notebook. But the air had changed. Our proximity was sharper now, almost daring us to cross the invisible line. I noticed how she shifted, leaning just enough that her arm brushed mine, small friction that left me shaking inside. She caught my gaze, and I quickly looked away, ashamed of how obvious my fascination had become. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as she pointed to a problem on the page. Here, try this method instead. Her hand brushed mine again, deliberate this time, lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. My pulse jumped. My fingers twitched as I tried to write the answer, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying that touch over and over. I wanted to lean closer, wanted to confess that I'd been thinking of her, of this, since the first week of class. But the hesitation in her eyes, the subtle retreat, kept me restrained. She wanted it too, I could feel it, but she was careful, pulling back at the precise moment that could have tipped everything over the edge. The room seemed to shrink, closing in on us, filled with silence and our restrained breathing. My hand brushed hers once more. Just a brief, accidental graze, but it was enough. Our eyes met, and neither of us looked away. The unspoken electricity between us was palpable, a dangerous game neither of us wanted to admit we were playing. And then, almost as if the universe decided to tease us, my phone vibrated sharply against the desk. I jumped, and she started slightly, her hand flinching from mine. The sudden interruption left our hearts racing, a reminder that the world outside this room existed, that what we were doing, or almost doing, wasn't supposed to happen. We exchanged a glance, charged and fleeting, before she spoke. "Focus?" she murmured, her voice low and almost trembling, but her eyes betrayed her. I could see the pull, the desire, the magnetic tension that neither of us was ready to release. And in that moment, I realized we were closer than ever, teetering on the edge of something we both knew we shouldn't cross. The room felt impossibly small now, the desk between us like a flimsy barrier. Every glance, every shift of weight, seemed magnified. Ms. Hartley leaned closer than before, her shoulder brushing mine with every movement, the subtle warmth radiating from her almost unbearable. My pulse hammered in my ears. I can't remember the last time I stayed this late," she murmured, her voice low, almost vulnerable, as she straightened a stack of papers. I wanted to reach for her hand, to steady her or maybe just feel it against mine, but the hesitation in her eyes froze me. There was a storm behind that composed exterior, an internal tug-of-war I couldn't name, but I could feel it. I watched her brush a lock of hair from her face, fingers lingering against her cheek, and my chest tightened. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, yet fraught with tension, like she was daring herself, and me not to cross a line. "You're different from the others," I said, my voice catching on the word different. She paused mid-motion, eyes flicking to mine with a sharp, questioning glance. The way she stared, quiet but intense, made my throat dry. "Different how?" she asked, voice soft but curious. Her body leaned ever so slightly toward me, the subtle shift igniting something I could barely contain. "I don't know," I muttered, fumbling with my pen. "I just notice things." The brush of her elbow against mine, the tilt of her head when she was thinking, the quiet way she exhaled after each word. I felt seen, and terrified by how much I wanted her to see more. Her lips curved in a faint smile, almost shy, almost teasing. She leaned just a fraction closer, enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath when she spoke. "Notice what?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and before I could answer, she reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The contact was electric, intimate in a way that shouldn't exist between us, and I felt my resolve begin to crumble. My hand twitched, aching to touch her, to hold her, to close the impossible gap. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other, caught in the tension, aware of every unspoken desire. And then she leaned slightly closer, her voice dropping even lower, almost a whisper. "You know, there are some lessons best learned up close." My breath hitched. The words weren't bold, but the subtext, the promise, it left me trembling. I wanted to respond, to confess everything my chest had been keeping locked away, but the sudden creak of the hallway outside made us both startle. She pulled back slightly, as if reality or caution had slammed into her. Yet even as she stepped a fraction away, the electricity between us didn't dissipate. If anything, it had grown sharper, hungrier, more impossible to ignore. Her eyes met mine one last time, heavy with unspoken things, and I realized we were on the precipice. One step forward, and nothing would ever be the same. A hand brushed mine. Almost a brush, almost a spark, and I knew. The moment was here. The question wasn't if we wanted it. The question was whether we dared. The silence after her whispered words felt heavier than any noise. My hand still tingled where hers had brushed mine, and my chest ached with anticipation and fear. But before either of us could act, the soft vibration of a phone on the desk startled us both. Ms. Hartley glanced at the screen. Her brow furrowed for a fraction of a second, a crack in her composed exterior I had never seen before. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the device, and for a moment, I wondered if she'd made a mistake. If someone else had noticed her, or worse, if she had. It's nothing, she said quickly, slipping the phone into her bag. But I caught the flash of tension in her eyes, a flicker of worry, a shadow behind the calm. She was hiding something, and suddenly, the room that had felt like ours alone now seemed precarious, fragile, as if the world outside could break in at any second. I wanted to ask her, to break the silence, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I watched the subtle changes. The way her shoulders tensed, the brief tightening of her jaw, the way she avoided my gaze for a heartbeat before daring to meet it again. Every micro-expression screamed that there was more. Something personal, something dangerous, that she wasn't telling me. And then she stepped closer, unavoidably close, her body brushing mine again. The warmth from that simple contact made me aware of the room, the air, the impossibility of the moment. My pulse raced as she leaned toward my ear, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to be careful. Someone might know." I swallowed hard. Know what? My own words felt small, inadequate, but I couldn't stop the tremor in my hands, the way my chest was threatening to betray me with its loud, uneven rhythm. Her fingers brushed a loose strand of hair from my forehead, lingering, gentle. "That this is more than it should be." She pulled back slightly, just enough to look into my eyes, the vulnerability in her gaze raw and disarming. It hit me then. The risk wasn't just the age gap or the impropriety. It was something more immediate, something external, something that could undo everything we had been inching toward. Her breath lingered near me, warm and scented with jasmine, and I realized I was trembling. Not from fear, not entirely, but from wanting her, needing her, and knowing how forbidden it all was. I stepped a fraction closer, and she mirrored the movement, the space between us shrinking until our chests nearly touched. Her hand brushed my arm, then rested there, steady but electrifying. I wanted to speak, to confess, to tell her that the risk was worth it, but I could feel her hesitation, her careful restraint. "Whatever happens," she whispered, her lips barely moving, "we can't let it be easy. Not yet." The words were a spark, lighting the tension between us. Desire and fear collided, making the air almost unbearable. Every instinct in me screamed to close the gap, to reach for her, but the caution in her eyes reminded me. The storm wasn't just inside the room. It was outside, waiting, watching. We stood there, suspended, inches apart. Her hand pressed lightly against my arm, a quiet reminder that we were tethered to each other, but only just. And in that silence, every heartbeat, every shiver, every stolen glance promised that what came next could change everything. The classroom felt impossibly close now, the shadows of the late evening stretching across the floor as if pressing us together. Every sound, the hum of the air conditioner, the faint creak of the building settling, seemed amplified, and my pulse drummed so loudly I was sure she could hear it. Miss Hartley stood just inches from me, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that left me breathless. The faint scent of jasmine curled around us like a quiet declaration, and the warmth of her body made my skin ache. I wanted to step closer, to close the impossible gap, but the hesitation in her gaze warned me. This was the precipice, and one false move could undo everything. I began, but the words caught in my throat. My fingers itched to reach for her, to feel her hand, to steady myself on her, but I froze under the weight of her stare. She tilted her head, lips parting slightly, and for a heartbeat, it felt like she was reading every thought in my mind. "You don't have to say it," she whispered, her voice low, intimate, vibrating against the air between us. Her hand hovered near mine, trembling just slightly, betraying the careful control she'd maintained all evening. I reached out slowly, almost afraid she might vanish if I moved too quickly, and our fingers brushed. The contact sent a shock through me, a spark too bright to ignore. Her eyes softened, flickering with something I couldn't name. Desire, fear, vulnerability, longing. "Are you sure?" she asked, barely audible, the words barely a shield for the storm she was holding back. I nodded, swallowing hard. "I've never been more sure of anything." And then she closed the space. Not aggressively, not recklessly. Deliberately, carefully, like a tide pulling me in. Her hand found mine fully, fingers intertwining, and the warmth of her touch anchored me. The tension that had been building for weeks, months, whatever this was, surged into something undeniable. She leaned closer, and I could feel the heat of her breath, the subtle quiver in her posture. My other hand rested lightly on her waist, the first tentative connection beyond mere brushing, and I felt her lean slightly into me. We were suspended in that moment, a perfect collision of restraint and surrender. "I don't care about the risk," I whispered, voice raw, almost trembling. "Not tonight." Her lips curved in a faint, almost shy smile, and the corner of her mouth tilted in recognition of the truth I'd spoken. "Neither do I," she murmured back. For a moment we simply stayed like that, breathing, trembling, touching. The tension didn't dissolve. It transformed into something warmer, softer, human. No words were needed. Our eyes, our fingers, our unsteady closeness said everything. Then, slowly, she rested her forehead against mine. I could feel the pulse in her temple, the quiet exhale of her breath, the tremble of her hand in mine. And in that fragile, electrifying contact, I realized something essential. We had crossed the line, yes, but we had done it together. The room was quiet again, but this time it felt safe, intimate, ours. The world outside still existed, with its risks and rules, but for this moment nothing else mattered. The evening had softened into something gentle, almost tender. The classroom, once a place of tension and unspoken desire, now felt like a cocoon around us. Miss Hartley and I remained close, our fingers still intertwined, but the raw ache of anticipation had eased into something warmer, steadier. She leaned back slightly, resting her shoulder against mine, and I could feel the subtle rise and fall of her breath. The faint scent of jasmine lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the closeness we had earned. I wanted to speak, to put words to the emotions thrumming between us, but the silence was perfect, rich with everything we didn't need to say. "You know," she murmured, voice low and soft, "I never expected it to be like this." Her eyes flicked up to mine, a mixture of amusement and vulnerability in their depths. I smiled, careful not to break the fragile intimacy, and squeezed her hand lightly. "Neither did I," I admitted. "But I'm glad it is." She let out a small, almost shy laugh, resting her head briefly against my shoulder. "Me too," she whispered, and the words, though simple, carried weight. The tension of secrecy, the fear of what might be, had melted away, at least for now, leaving only the quiet certainty of our connection. I tilted my head, brushing my lips gently against her hair, savoring the softness, the warmth, the human reality of her presence. She shivered lightly at the touch, and I felt a swell of protective longing. This wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, a recognition that we had both been yearning for connection, for understanding, for someone who saw us fully. Her hand moved to rest against my chest, fingers splayed lightly, and I leaned down, letting my forehead rest against hers. Our eyes met, wide and unguarded, and I could see the flicker of joy, relief, and something tenderly vulnerable in her expression. "Promise me," she said softly, almost hesitantly. "Promise me we won't rush this, that we'll let it grow." "I promise," I replied, my voice steady despite the rapid beat of my heart. We'll take our time. She smiled, and the faint curve of her lips made my chest ache in the best way. I tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, brushing my fingers along her cheek, savoring the warmth, the softness, the quiet intimacy. We remained there, shoulder to shoulder, fingers intertwined, foreheads pressed together. The room outside no longer mattered. Age, rules, risk, all of it had melted away in the simple truth of being together. Eventually, she sighed, a sound full of contentment, and leaned closer, resting her head against mine. I felt the steady beat of her heart beneath my hand, and I knew that, for the first time in a long while, we were both exactly where we belonged. The tension had eased, replaced by something richer, warmer, and infinitely more human. We had crossed boundaries, yes, but we had done it together, and now there was no rush, no pressure, just the quiet promise of something real, something worth exploring. As the last light of evening faded through the blinds, I held her close and whispered, "We'll figure it out, together." Her soft laugh was the only reply, and it was enough. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next?